The story of this quilt is full of sorrow and heartbreak. But even more than that, it's full of comfort and hope. So grab a box of tissues and a warm, comforting beverage, and let me tell you the story of my inspirational quote, Crazy Quilt. What I'm going to do is while I'm talking, is to show you some pictures and some videos so you can get an overall feel for the quilt and some of the details. But after that, I'm going to stop talking so you can get a closer look at each of the blocks on the quilt. It all started way back in 2002. I had a friend who was having a hard time, and I thought that I could give her a comfort quilt that would make her feel a little bit better. I thought about making, say, like a signature block with inspirational quotes on it. And because they were signature blocks, I thought another thing I could do is to make a block swap. Lots of people were swapping blocks at the time, and I thought that if I could swap some blocks, I could get a variety of inspirational quotes, things that could comfort a person. So I hosted a block swap with one of my news groups, so other people could also provide some of the blocks for this quilt. It would be like support from the whole community rather than just from me. I chose a block with white triangles on the outside so that the block could be trimmed at the end by the person who receives the blocks, so that all of the blocks would be the same size at the end. This would make up for the varying seam allowances amongst the different quilters. The problem with block swaps is that you have to give time for quilters to make their blocks, and you have to give time for them to be mailed in, and time for you to swap them out, and for you to mail them back out again. And by the time that the blocks were ready to be sewn together, it'd been more than a month. Then you still had to trim the blocks and sew them together and sandwich the quilt and quilt the quilt and bind it. And I wasn't sure. I wanted to give a quilt to my friend because it was kind of late. I wasn't sure how happy she'd be to get a quilt that just reminded her of something hard that she went through. And if you have a friend who needs comforting, you need to do that faster. By the time that I got the blocks swapped, I felt like it was too late to gift the quilt. Who wants a quilt that reminds you of hard times that you just went through? So the blocks sat for a while, a few years, and then finally I put them together. Although I like the idea of trimming the blocks to make them all the same size, in theory, I don't really like doing that in practice. So I put the blocks together improv style. The quilt is structurally sound and lays flat, but the corners of the quilt aren't quite put together the way that a traditional quilt is supposed to be. And so now it's not a traditional quilt because of my creative use of corners. It's also not really an improv quilt because the quilt started out as very traditional blocks. Both camps would probably think it was just a sloppily made traditional quilt. I don't know why I was worrying about what others would think. I had been looking at crazy quilts and embroidery, and I thought that some embroidery would be a nice addition to enhance the quilt. I thought I couldn't really make it worse than it already is. It's an imperfect quilt, and even if my embroidery stitches are also likewise imperfect, I think it would be fine. I've also had people tell me I'm not allowed to call it a crazy quilt. This is the first block that I embroidered. I did this way back when I put the quilt together. There's a lot of white space on this block, so I thought I could just add this embroidery pattern, and I really like the way it looks. And I really like the idea of making crazy quilt stitches on it. So here I added some ribbon to cover the seams and some embroidery here. But then I thought about the size of this quilt. But as you can see, it is a big quilt. It's life size pretty much for me. That's a lot of stuff to embroider, and I wasn't sure and I knew that it would take hours of work. It would take a couple hours just to finish the quilt as it was, but it would take even more hours with a capital H to add crazy quilt stitches on this quilt. And I wasn't sure if it would be worth it. Would it really be worth spending hours on a quilt that was this imperfect? And because I have a job and other hobbies, and I'd like to make other quilts besides this one, I wasn't quite sure whether I would be up for making this much embroidery. I don't do that much embroidery, and I wasn't sure if I could handle it. And so basically I put the quilt aside again, and I waited for a few years until 2019 when I picked it back up again. I was watching some YouTube videos, and there were some more videos about crazy quilt stitching and embroidery and the slow stitching movement, and I thought that it would be worth the effort to try this again, to bring this back out again and just put a few more stitches on it. What I thought I could do is just, instead of committing to a whole big quilt like this, what I would do is just add a few more motifs here and there. And if what I would do is I would put them throughout the quilt instead of in any one section. And so when I decided that I had had enough, I could just stop. And I may have to add just one or two more motifs to make it balance, to make sure that all the designs were balanced throughout the quilt. But it would be done when it was done, and I didn't have to commit to making a crazy quilt. I could just add some more stitches, and that would be just fine. As I said, that was back in 2019, and I'm so glad that I picked this quilt up, because the next year was 2020. I've already warned you, right, that this was a sad story. So let's talk about 2020 now. January 1, 2020. Slept on couch last night to keep Zeus company during the neighbors' fireworks. February 29th, Leap Day, COVID-19 comes to U.S. in Seattle. March 10th, COVID-19 has come to the state of Ohio. OSU and other schools have canceled classes. March 11th, 2020, COVID-19 is now officially a pandemic. March 14th, Pi Day. A man in Columbus tested positive for COVID-19. March 19th, President Trump has canceled all standardized tests for the year. March 24, the Tokyo Olympics has been postponed a year over coronavirus concerns. The athletes have not been able to train during the shutdowns. I knew early on, as soon as the pandemic hit, that I wouldn't be able to work, that I would not have my normal work. March 27, 2020, last day of work due to COVID-19, with tests canceled, no work is available. I wasn't quite sure what would happen with my employment. April 5, getting information about another job. But my company found another job for us to do. This was a very different job. It's a different department completely, and it had a lot of growing pains because they were moving from a physical location to a virtual location, so there were a lot of growing pains. Even though the pay was much less than the original position, I worked on that job for a few months. Another thing that I was going through is that my dog was not doing well. He was getting older, and he had a disease. He had degenerative myopathy, which is not curable. So working on this quilt just gave me a lot of comfort in order to be able to give me something to do that would take my mind off of the problems that I already had. It was also nice to be able to work on applique like this, because I was watching a lot of the news and listening to governors' press conferences, not just my own governor, but also from other states as well, just to see what was happening throughout the world. Eventually, I decided to stop feeling sorry for myself. My life in some ways was better than it had been before. I got to visit with people from all over the world online. People delivered groceries to my car. People delivered library books to my car, and I got to meet my neighbors as I was walking my dog, and the streets were not crowded. So let me show you some of the motifs that I have in this quilt. I know I don't have time to tell you the story of each and every single motif. Basically, a lot of them are just things that I found on the internet or things that I found interesting. I wasn't trying to make any kind of statement, or there was no rhyme or reason really to the motifs that I added. It was just something that if I was scrolling through the internet and I found something interesting, I would add that motif, or if I just had an idea, then I could just run with it. The whole point was just to fill this up as much as possible, and I wasn't going to try to be too particular about what was in the quilt. And then over time, I added this applique. So it started here, and then I decided that stitches this small, motifs this small, would take a lot of time to fill up this quilt, and I needed to make my motifs bigger. And so I added this bird here, this bird is a little bit hard to see because it's just so big that people may not necessarily look for it here. And so I decided after that that I really should make my motifs bolder and brighter to make them more noticeable. And that's how I kept going with the rest of these. I think this one was pretty close to the beginning too. This one, though she is but little, she is fierce. I wrote those in sloppy handwriting on purpose because it is. This quilt is not a perfect quilt, and it's not meant to be perfect. I was going to just go ahead and lean into the imperfection of the quilt and just make the stitches as I wanted and not worry about everything being perfect. It already isn't. And this gave me a lot of confidence, I guess, to make this girl, gave me a lot of confidence to put in the rest of the stitches. These daisies are here to represent my blog name. I was Shasta Matova on the blog. And then I wound up thinking about applique. I thought that if I just appliqued some fabric, it wouldn't take a lot of effort on my part. I just grabbed some pretty fabric and cut it up into a shape. And I cut this one out. It was just a nice circle that kind of reminded me of COVID. The way the design forms, it just kind of reminded me of the COVID virus. I was planning on just letting it be a subtle nod to the times, but I thought years from now people are not going to think of this as a COVID block, a COVID virus, because it really doesn't look that much like one. So I decided to go ahead and just write COVID in the inside. Wrote here, if we can get through coronavirus, we can get through anything. And once I made this block, then I decided to go ahead and lean also into the history, the historical time that I'm making this quilt. By that time, a lot of people had been talking about pandemic quilts. And so for this quilt, I decided to just go ahead and make it a historical record of the year. And also when I was looking at the time period of the quilt here, 2002 to 2020, it's an interesting, I like the dates, how they echo. And so I decided to try to think of things that had happened between 2002 and 2020 in my life and in history that would help show the life of this quilt. So I had added President Obama, and I added Ruth Bader Ginsburg here first. And I also added other motifs that you may not be able to tell are historical references. I have a dog, I have books, an alphabet. I have a lot of things that represent my family members and things that represent things that happen in my life, but they're more subtle in here that you may not necessarily be able to, it may not be obvious to you. There's a quilter, just to make sure that that was there. This is a quilt that my niece made for me, so it was nice to be able to add that into the quilt. This is, I was cleaning out my basement, and this little lady here, I added her, and after I added her, I decided I did want to add more dimension to the quilt, so that's why I added this quilter that I made with stump work, and this one as well, made with stump work. And this bow tie is another thing that came from the basement. It was on a purse. I was cleaning out my basement that year, so some of these are from that. I also, when I was thinking about the historical record, I was thinking about adding names of people onto this quilt, people who had passed away in my family, but I wasn't sure if that was something that I would want all over the quilt because it would maybe make people sad about that. And, you know, you may not always be ready to remember somebody who has passed away. And so what I decided to do is to make this little booklet. And in this booklet it's a book that has names of people who have passed away. And in my extended family, and I went back in time. Some of these are before 2002, but I did not want to leave anyone out. June 25th. It was an exhausting day, thinking we should cancel the birthday party because of the coronavirus situation. We want to make sure we all make it out alive after the COVID-19 situation and don't want to give it to each other. There was a family that got infected after a birthday party, and 2 of them died. June 26th. My brother died early this morning. This video is dedicated to my brother Safiq. We miss you so much. I hadn't finished printing out the names of this book when my brother passed away. So his name is also in the quilt. June 30, took Zeus to the vet today. The assistant took him inside while I waited in the car. He has elevated liver and pancreas enzymes, which means he could have an infection, inflammation, or a tumor. July 13th. Got an email that last day of work is Friday. And after that, I just dove more into the quilt, and I needed more comforting, and I really dove into the quilt and made more motifs. And it was easy for me to find the time to do it because I had stopped working by that time. And so I had time to sit and watch the news and make more designs on this quilt. So throughout the year, I kept thinking of ideas and writing a list of ideas that I wanted to add and continuing making more motifs. And because I had the year 2020 on there, I decided, you know, it's probably time to stop at the end of the year. I put this date on it way before the end of the year. And eventually I decided what I was going to do is that would be my deadline. And I should finish by December. I didn't finish in that time period. I still had a lot of ideas that I wanted to implement that I hadn't gotten through. And what I decided to do is to stop the clock at 2020. I could add the designs that were already on my list of designs to make, but the historical record stops at 2020. The quilt ideas stop at 2020. So the only things I could continue to add are the things that I had decided to add to the quilt in 2020. It took me a while to actually implement all the ideas. Things were opening up again in 2021 and I was working again. So this quilt didn't actually get finished until September 11th, 2021. September 11th happened before 2002. It happened in 2001, but it was something that was heavy on my mind when I was making these blocks, and so I think it's kind of appropriate that it is a date that is on this quilt. This quilt is the reason that I started my YouTube channel. I did keep up with my blog to show people as I was adding motifs, and a lot of my blog friends wanted to see the quilt in person and they wanted to see it better together, and so that's why I wanted to make a YouTube channel that I could show a video about this quilt. Pictures just don't do it justice. In a photograph, it's not so easy to tell the size of the motif. It's also not easy to see how the motif works with the other motifs that are around it. It's also not easy to see where the motif is in relation to the whole quilt. And so I wanted to make this video to show you this quilt. A lot of my blog friends have wanted to see this in person, and I think a video is a good way to at least see it a little bit more interactively than a photograph would do. I'm happy that I'm finally able to show it to you. My inspirational quote, Crazy Quilt, was started in 2002 before I started keeping records. It was finished on September 11th, 2021. It's 46 by 62 inches. The lessons I learned is that perfection is overrated. You can make a beautiful quilt even if it isn't perfect. Also, that handwork is a lot of fun and it's definitely worth the effort, no matter how much time it takes. I learned that the quilts are worth finishing, no matter how old they are. Sometimes some quilts just have to wait for when the time is right. And finally, I learned that quilts also comfort the maker as much as they comfort the person that the quilt is intended for. This video is one of a series of videos that I've made about each of my quilts. I'll put a link here to the playlist where you can see more of them. Please subscribe to my channel so you don't miss the next videos. Thank you for watching. I appreciate all of your support, and I'll see you in the next video.